Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku was an invincible universe and became superboy. Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The sound that heralded the arrival of a god was not thunder, but a sharp, surgical crack that tore through the placid suburban air. From his second-story window, Izuku Midoriya didn't even flinch. He was used to it. His pencil, a well-worn 2B graphite, merely paused its frantic scratching across the page of his notebook. He lifted his head, green eyes wide with an intensity that bordered on worship. Below, on the perfectly manicured lawn of the house next door, a figure descended. It wasn't a graceful landing, not like the ones depicted in the officially licensed comic books. It was a landing of absolute purpose, a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence written in violence. Nolan Grayson, Omni-Man to the world, Mr. Grayson to the neighborhood, hit the grass with enough force to send a concentric ripple through the turf, his heavy blue and white boots sinking an inch into the soil. There was no crater, no ostentatious display. Just the quiet, terrifying assertion of mass and velocity brought to a perfect, instantaneous halt. His white cape, tattered and scorched at the edges, settled around him like a shroud. A thin trickle of alien purple blood ran from a cut above his famous mustache, stark against the weathered bronze of his skin. He stood there for a moment, a statue of impossible strength amidst a backdrop of picket fences and garden gnomes, his shoulders slumped with a weariness that no mortal man could ever comprehend. Izuku's pencil was a blur. Landing velocity still displays 0-point energy conversion. He muttered under his breath, his free hand gesturing vaguely in the air as if sculpting the physics of the event. No visible kinetic dispersal into the ground. The energy has to be shunted. Where? An internal biobattery? Or a dimensional pocket? The suit shows Class 4 plasma scoring, but only on the cape. Tactical decision? Using the cape as a disposable shield to protect the primary suit integrity? Brilliant. Minimalist and effective. His notebook, volume 17 of his lifelong project, Hero Analysis for the Future, was already half filled with sketches of the man next door. There was Omni-Man stopping a meteor, rendered in painstaking cross-hatching. Omni-Man lifting an aircraft carrier, with detailed notes on weight distribution and potential structural failure points. And now, a new entry, a quick, dynamic sketch of the landing, arrows pointing to the damaged cape, the trickle of blood, the posture of fatigue. Subject Omni-Man, incident, unidentified off-world incursion, Quadrant 7. Note the exhaustion. Viltrumite stamina is near limitless, so this implies either a prolonged engagement, or an opponent of significant power. The blood is non-humanoid viscous. Suggests an insectoid or silicon-based biology. Izuku, honey? Are you watching the Graysons again? The voice, gentle and laced with a familiar maternal worry, pulled him from his trance. He looked down from his window to see his mother, Inko Midoriya, tending to her small garden patch that separated their modest 2-story house from the Graysons' larger, more modern one. She held a trowel in one hand, her green hair tied back in a practical bun, a smudge of dirt on her cheek. Just observing, Mom, he called down, his voice cracking with teenage awkwardness. Mr. Grayson just got back. Looks like it was a tough one, Inko sighed, a soft sound of resignation. I'm sure Debbie will be glad to have him home. Try not to stare, dear. It's rude. It's not staring, it's analysis. Izuku protested, but he pulled back from the window anyway, his face flushing. He retreated into the sanctuary of his bedroom, a space that was less a room and more a meticulously curated museum of heroism. The walls were a vibrant collage of posters, news clippings, and magazine covers. There was Red Rush, a scarlet blur frozen mid-sprint. War Woman, her mace held high, her expression one of regal fury. Aquarius, Lord of the Deep, and the Green Ghost, an ethereal specter of justice. The Guardians of the Globe, Earth's premier super team, were everywhere, but one figure dominated them all. Omni-Man. A life-size poster of him hung on the back of Izuku's door, his arms crossed, that faint, unreadable smile on his face. He wasn't just a hero, he was the hero, the benchmark. The unbreachable wall against which all the horrors of the universe broke. In a world teeming with powered individuals, aliens, mutants, cyborgs, magicians, Omni-Man was in a class of one. He was power made manifest. He was hope. And Izuku Midoriya, in this world of gods and monsters, was tragically, hopelessly, and irrevocably normal. He had no alien heritage. He'd never been doused in radioactive chemicals, bitten by a genetically engineered spider, or chosen by a mystical artifact. He was just Izuku, the boy with a hero's heart trapped in a body that couldn't even pass the minimum physical requirements for the local police academy. He was, in the parlance of a world he'd never known, quirkless. His mother found him a few minutes later, hunched over his desk, the lamplight illuminating the feverish scratching of his pencil. She leaned against the doorframe, holding 2 glasses of iced tea. "Debbie just texted," she said, her voice soft. "She's invited us over for a cookout tonight. A welcome home thing for Nolan." Izuku's head snapped up, his eyes shining. "Really? A cookout? With Mr. Grayson?" Inko managed a small smile, though her eyes were filled with a deep, abiding concern she rarely voiced. She walked over and placed a glass on a coaster on his desk, the only clear space amidst the clutter of notebooks, schematics, and news articles. "Yes. And Mark will be there. It would be good for you to talk about, you know, normal teenage things. Video games. School. Girls?" Izuku ducked his head, his cheeks burning. "Mark and I talk about stuff. You talk about heroes, Izuku. You asked him questions about his father that he doesn't know the answers to, and he gets embarrassed." She gently touched the cover of his open notebook. The detailed drawing of Omni-Man's tired face stared up at them. "Honey, we've talked about this. The GDA aptitude tests, I know," Izuku mumbled, his enthusiasm draining away like water through a sieve. He had taken them all. Strategic Command, Support Staff, Tech and RD. His analytical scores were off the charts, but they were always accompanied by a polite but firm rejection. His obsession with heroes was flagged as a potential liability. He was too invested, too emotional, lacks professional detachment, one review had stated. "It's not fair," he whispered, tracing the powerful lines of Omni-Man's jaw with his fingertip. "I know more about their powers than they do. I see things they miss. I could help. I know I could." Inko's heart ached. She knelt beside him, wrapping an arm around his thin shoulders. "I know you could, sweetie. You have the heart of the greatest hero I've ever known, but this world, it's not just about heart. It's dangerous." She squeezed him tightly. "I just want you to be safe." Izuku leaned into her embrace, the familiar scent of her floral perfume a small comfort. He didn't say anything. What could he say? She was right. But being right didn't make the truth any less bitter. It didn't stop the burning fire in his chest that screamed at him to do something when he saw people in danger on the news. It didn't stop the phantom feeling of power that coursed through his limbs when he dreamed at night, dreams where he could fly, where he was strong, where he could stand beside Omni-Man and help him bear the weight of the world. He woke from those dreams to the crushing gravity of his own powerlessness. Every single time. A few hours later, the smell of grilling burgers and hot dogs had replaced the earlier tension in the air. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the adjacent backyards. On the Graysons' patio, a top-of-the-line gas grill sizzled under the expert supervision of Debbie Grayson. She was a whirlwind of practiced hospitality, flipping patties with one hand and refreshing Inko's glass of wine with the other. "Honestly, Inko, I don't know how he does it," Debbie said, shaking her head as she gestured vaguely towards the sky with her spatula. "He comes home looking like he went 10 rounds with a black hole, and an hour later he's asking if the lawn needs mowing. The man has no off switch." Inko laughed, a genuine, relaxed sound that Izuku was relieved to hear. "You could say the same about my Izuku and those notebooks of his. I think he's mapped out every single one of Nolan's victories since he first appeared." Debbie smiled warmly over at Izuku, who was sitting at a patio table with Mark, engaged in a heated debate. "He's a good kid. Smart as a whip. You should be proud." "I am," Inko said, her gaze softening. "I just worry." At the table, the subject was, predictably, heroes, though filtered through the lens of their favorite fighting game. "It's total bull. Chaos Fist Ultimate is way too overpowered, Mark complained, throwing his hands up in exasperation. He was lanky and perpetually slouching, his expression a carefully cultivated mask of teenage apathy that sometimes slipped, revealing the anxious kid underneath. There's no counter. It's just a press and win button. There is a counter, Izuku insisted, leaning forward, his own burger forgotten. His ultimate has a 12-frame startup animation. If you use a character with a frame 1 invincible move, like Shadow Blade's teleport slash, you can phase right through the initial shockwave and get a full punish combo. The problem is, everyone tries to block or jump, but his area of effect is too big. You have to react to the animation, not the attack itself. Mark stared at him, blinked slowly, and then took a large bite of his burger. Dude, he said after a moment of chewing. It's a game. I'm just trying to have fun, not write a doctoral thesis on it. But winning is fun, Izuku countered. And understanding the mechanics is how you win. Mark just shook his head, a small smirk playing on his lips. This was their dynamic. Izuku's boundless, analytical enthusiasm and Mark's determined attempt to just be a normal guy. It was a strange friendship, forged in the crucible of their unique circumstances. They were the only two kids on the block who knew that the rumbling in the basement was not, in fact, a faulty water heater, but a high-tech communications array linked to a global defense network. They were bonded by a secret that one of them desperately wanted to be a part of, and the other desperately wanted to ignore. Speaking of which, Izuku said, lowering his voice conspiratorially, I saw your dad land earlier. The damage to his cape, was it flaxen energy rifles? The scorch patterns were consistent with their pulse technology, but the color was off. Mark sighed, the sound long and drawn out. Izuku, I don't know. He doesn't, we don't talk about it. He comes home, he's dad. That's it, but you're his son. You live with him. You must have noticed things. Like, what's his resting heart rate? Does he even have one? And his diet, it seems to be normal American food. But is that for fuel or for appearances? Does Viltrumite biology even require caloric intake? Or is it based on solar radiation like Superman in the old DC comics? Because if it is, the efficiency of his energy conversion would have to be over 100%, which violates the laws of thermodynamics unless he's drawing energy from another dimension. Dude! Stop! Mark hissed, glancing nervously over his shoulder at his father. Nolan Grayson had showered and changed into a casual polo shirt and khaki shorts. He looked for all the world like any other suburban dad, flipping burgers and laughing at a joke from one of the other neighbors who'd wandered over. But there was a stillness to him, a density. The air around him seemed to bend, to acknowledge his presence. Even when he was standing still, he seemed to be moving at 1,000 miles per hour. He caught Mark's nervous glance, and his eyes flickered towards Izuku. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. It was a look Izuku had seen before. The look a man gives a small, yapping dog that is trying its best to be intimidating. It was amusement. Patronizing and absolute. Debbie, ever the social savant, seemed to sense the tension. She walked over to the boys' table. Izuku, you know, Nolan was just saying he was impressed with that report you did for your civics class last year. The one on collateral damage mitigation during superhuman engagements. Izuku's eyes went wide. He read that? He glanced at it. Debbie corrected gently. But he said your ideas about using controlled sonic booms to create temporary atmospheric shields were interesting. She turned to her husband. Nolan, honey, come and settle a debate for these two. Izuku has some questions. Mark's face paled. Mom, no, it's fine, we were just... But it was too late. Omni-Man was approaching. He moved with a quiet grace that belied his immense power, pulling up a chair and sitting down at their table. The plastic patio chair creaked ominously but held. He picked up one of Izuku's abandoned French fries and popped it into his mouth. Questions? Nolan said, his voice a low, pleasant rumble. He looked directly at Izuku, and for a second, the friendly neighbor facade dropped. Izuku felt like he was being X-rayed. His every thought and insecurity laid bare. It was the gaze of a predator, ancient and patient, momentarily curious about the fluttering of a butterfly's wings. Izuku's throat went dry. All his carefully prepared questions, All his analytical bravado evaporated. He was sitting across from God, and God was waiting for him to speak. He stammered, his mind a total blank. He wanted to know about your cape. Mark mumbled, trying to steer the conversation to the safest possible topic. Nolan glanced down at his immaculate polo shirt as if he could still feel the phantom weight of his cape. It gets torn. A lot, Art, he said, nodding towards the Grayson's resident superhero tailor. Is getting very tired of me. Is it a proprietary fabric? Izuku squeaked out, finally finding his voice. A molecularly bonded nanoweave? Because I was thinking, if it's designed to be disposable, maybe integrating a controlled burn layer could be more effective. Upon impact from an energy weapon, it could combust and vent the energy outwards, protecting you completely. The only drawback would be fighting in a flammable environment, but the tactical advantages. He trailed off, realizing he was rambling. Nolan was watching him with that same detached amusement, but there was something else in his eyes now. A flicker of cold, hard calculation. That's a thought, son, Nolan said, his tone placid. But sometimes the simplest solution is the most effective. A strong shield is better than a complicated one, but what about opponents who are as strong as you? Izuku pressed, emboldened by the fact that he hadn't been immediately dismissed. There have to be some. The universe is vast. In those situations, brute force is negated. It becomes about tactics, strategy, endurance. What happens when you face someone who can't be overpowered? What's your weakness? The air grew heavy. The cheerful sounds of the cookout, the sizzling grill, the neighbors laughing, seemed to fade into the distance. Mark was frozen, his eyes wide with horror, mouthing shut up, shut up, shut up at Izuku. Debbie, who had been listening from the grill, stopped flipping a burger. Nolan's smile didn't waver, but it didn't reach his eyes. The coldness in them intensified, like a deep freeze settling over a placid lake. Weakness, Omni-Man repeated, the word tasting strange in his mouth. He leaned forward slightly, his forearms resting on the table. The flimsy plastic creaked in protest. That's a human concept, Izuku. You look for weakness because you are, by your very nature, fragile. You build societies, laws, moral codes. All of it is a shield against the fundamental truth that you are soft, and the universe is hard. He looked from Izuku's terrified face to Mark's, and his expression softened almost imperceptibly. True strength isn't about not having weaknesses. It's about being so powerful that your weaknesses don't matter. It's about being the one hard thing that the universe breaks against, and not the other way around. He leaned back, the moment broken. He picked up another French fry. But to answer your question, my only weakness is my charming wife's cooking. If I eat too much, I won't be able to fit into the suit. Debbie let out a nervous laugh, and the spell was shattered. The ambient sound of the party rushed back in. Nolan stood up and clapped a hand on Mark's shoulder, a gesture that was meant to be fatherly but made the boy flinch from its sheer weight. Come on, son! Help me with these burgers. Let your friend finish his analysis. He walked away, leaving Izuku sitting in a pool of stunned silence. His heart was hammering against his ribs, not from fear, but from a profound, earth-shattering sense of awe. He hadn't been dismissed. He had been given a glimpse. A peek behind the curtain, into the philosophy of a true hero. It's about being the one hard thing. That wasn't a platitude. It was a mission statement. The burden of being Omni-Man wasn't just physical. It was philosophical. He had to be absolute, unyielding, because the alternative was a world consumed by chaos. The coldness Izuku had seen wasn't cruelty. It was the resolve of a man carrying an impossible weight. Mark slumped back in his chair, letting out a breath he seemed to have been holding for minutes. Are you trying to get us all killed? He whispered, his voice shaking slightly. That was amazing. Izuku breathed, his eyes distant and unfocused. He was already reaching for the pen he always kept in his pocket, his mind racing to capture the revelation. He's even more incredible than I thought. Mark just stared at him, a look of complete and utter disbelief on his face. You're insane. You know that, right? Completely and totally insane. Later that night, long after the cookout had ended and the last of the neighbors had gone home, Izuku was back in his room. The light from his desk lamp was the only illumination, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. His notebook was open, and his pen flew across the page, not with sketches, but with words, theories, and philosophical musings. Omni-Man's core philosophy, the principle of absolute strength. It is not a goal, but a state of being. He does not aspire to be the strongest. He is the strongest, and his actions are a reflection of that reality. The perceived coldness is not a character flaw, but a necessary psychological shield. To feel the weight of every life, to mourn every loss, would be debilitating. He operates on a macro level, saving the species, the planet. Emotional detachment is a prerequisite for that scale of heroism. He cannot afford the weakness of conventional human empathy. He was reframing everything he knew about the hero. The brutal efficiency, the lack of fanfare, the dismissive attitude towards lesser threats. It wasn't arrogance. It was the triage of a god. He walked to his window and looked out. The light in the Graysons' kitchen was on. He could see Debbie moving around, cleaning up, her silhouette small and human. The house looked so normal, so peaceful. It was impossible to reconcile the cozy, domestic scene with the cosmic truth of the man who lived there. As he watched, the quiet of the night was shattered by the shrill ring of a telephone from the house next door. A few moments later, the kitchen light went out. Then, another light flicked on in the living room. A news bulletin suddenly interrupted the late-night movie playing softly on the small television in the corner of Izuku's room. A serious-looking anchorwoman appeared on screen. We repeat, the Mahler twins, the notoriously brilliant and violent supercriminals, have escaped from the Global Defense Agency's high-security penitentiary. They were last seen heading into downtown Chicago. The GDA has issued a citywide alert. Izuku's head snapped towards the TV, then back to the Graysons' house. He saw movement. The front door opened. Nolan Grayson stepped out, but he wasn't in his khakis anymore. He was in the suit. The blue and white was stark in the moonlight, the red O a bloody promise on his chest. He exchanged a few brief words with Debbie, who stood in the doorway, her arms wrapped around herself. He gave her a quick, almost perfunctory kiss, and then he looked up. For a heart-stopping second, Izuku thought Omni-Man was looking right at him. The hero's gaze swept over the neighborhood, over Izuku's house, a silent guardian checking his perimeter one last time before heading into battle. Then, with a barely audible whisper of displaced air, he bent his knees and launched himself into the heavens. He didn't streak away in a blaze of glory. He just vanished. One moment he was there, a titan in the moonlight, and the next, there was only a faint, upward-rushing trail of disturbed air and the distant, fading sonic boom that was his signature. Izuku stood at the window, his hand pressed against the cool glass, his breath fogging the pane. Mark saw his dad. Debbie saw her husband. The world saw its savior. But Izuku, in that moment, saw something more. He saw perfection. The flawless union of impossible power and unwavering resolve. He saw the ideal he had spent his entire life dreaming of, a symbol so pure and absolute it made his own mundane existence feel like a pale, insignificant shadow. He watched the empty, stardusted sky where the hero had disappeared, a single, reverent tear tracing a path down his cheek. He's perfect, Izuku whispered to the night. A true symbol of peace, the pilgrimage to Valhalla Comics collectibles was a sacred rite for Izuku Midoriya. It was a 15-minute bus ride downtown to a narrow, unassuming storefront wedged between a vape shop and a laundromat. To the uninitiated, it was just another nerdy hideaway, smelling of old paper, dust, and ozone from the vintage arcade cabinet humming in the back. To Izuku, it was a cathedral. He pushed open the door, a small bell chiming his arrival. The proprietor, a bearish man in his late 40s named Sal, looked up from behind a counter cluttered with grading tools and price guides. His face, framed by a wiry gray beard, broke into a knowing grin. "Let me guess, Midoriya." Sal's voice was a gravelly boom. "Here to gaze upon the Holy Grail again? Maybe burn a little incense? Say a prayer to the god of four-color printing?" Izuku's face flushed a brilliant shade of red. I have the money this time, Sal." Sal's eyebrows shot up. He leaned over the counter, his expression shifting from amusement to genuine surprise. "You're kidding me. All of it?" The lawn mowing, the grocery bagging, the tutoring, you finally scraped it together? Izuku nodded, his entire body vibrating with a nervous energy that was barely contained. He unzipped his signature yellow backpack and carefully extracted a thick, lumpy envelope. He placed it on the counter with the reverence of a knight laying his sword at a king's feet. Sal picked it up. It was heavy. He didn't count it. He knew the kid. Izuku Midoriya was probably the most honest person he'd ever met. With a theatrical sigh, Sal turned and reached under the counter. He produced a key, unlocked a reinforced glass display case behind him, and carefully, with 2 hands, lifted out the treasure. It was a comic book, but to call it that felt like a disservice. It was an artifact. Omni-Man 1. First printing, 1988. The cover was a masterpiece of classic superhero art. Omni-Man, his jaw set, his cape flowing, effortlessly stopping a crashing passenger jet with one hand while waving reassuringly to the terrified people inside with the other. The colors were still vibrant, the image a perfect distillation of power and benevolence. It was encased in a hard, clear plastic slab, graded a near mint 9.6. Been saving this for you, Sal said, his voice softer now. He slid it across the counter. Knew you were serious. Had a guy from New York offer me 20% more last week. Told him to take a hike. Izuku's hands trembled as he reached for it. His fingers brushed against the smooth, cold plastic. This was it. The very first appearance. The genesis of the symbol. Before the Guardians of the Globe, before the world-shaking battles, there was just this. A promise. A statement of intent printed on cheap pulp paper. Thank you, Sal, Izuku whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He couldn't look away from the cover. Thank you? Don't thank me. You earned it, kid. Sal started counting the crumpled bills and loose change in the envelope. Just try not to drool on it. That'll drop the grade for sure. Izuku clutched the slabbed comic to his chest. It was his most prized possession, a tangible link to his idol. He felt a ridiculous, giddy joy bubble up inside him. For a moment, the world felt right. The chasm between his dreams and his reality didn't seem so vast. Holding this piece of history, he felt closer to the hero than ever before. He was so lost in his reverie that he didn't notice the first tremor. A low, subterranean vibration that made the long boxes of back issues rattle on their shelves. Sal paused his counting. The hell was that? Train derailment? The second tremor was stronger. The lights flickered. The vintage Galaga cabinet in the back let out a distorted electronic scream and went dark. Outside, the cheerful Saturday afternoon ambience of the city was abruptly punctured by a chorus of car alarms. Izuku's analytical mind, a finely honed machine of pattern recognition, kicked into gear. No, he said, his voice suddenly sharp. That's not a derailment. Derailments are high-frequency vibrations. This is low-frequency, increasing in amplitude. It's coming from below. Like a tectonic event, but localized. Before Sal could process that, the world exploded. The storefront window didn't just shatter, it atomized, blown inwards in a crystalline hurricane of glass. The sound was a physical blow, a deafening crump that was felt in the bones, followed by the high-pitched shriek of tortured metal and the primal, terrified screams of 100 people at once. Izuku was thrown from his feet, his new comic flying from his grasp. He hit the back wall with a painful thud, his head ringing. He scrambled up, his ears roaring, the air thick with a choking cloud of dust and pulverized concrete. The front of the comic shop was gone, sheared away as if by a giant's hand. In its place was a scene of apocalyptic devastation. The street had buckled upwards. A massive fissure, 20 feet wide, had split the asphalt. Out of it, a creature was unfurling. It was a nightmare of chitin and sinew, a biological horror that defied earthly classification. It was easily 60 feet tall, a monstrous hybrid of a centipede and a praying mantis. Dozens of scythe-like limbs, each the size of a car, scrabbled for purchase on the broken pavement, while a segmented, armored body coiled into the sky. Its head was a triangular wedge of black carapace, devoid of eyes, with a quivering maw that gaped and hissed, spraying a foul-smelling ichor. A Clytine void crawler, a Class 8 bioweapon banned in 3 galaxies. Izuku's brain supplied the data from a GDA threat file he'd hacked into last year, even as his stomach churned with terror. His first instinct, the one that had been drilled into him by years of hero worship, was not to run. It was to observe. Gotta see it! Gotta analyze it! The frantic, nerdy part of his brain screamed. Its underbelly is less armored. Joint structure looks vulnerable to high-impact piercing attacks. Where are the heroes? He saw Sal crawling behind the remains of the counter, his face ashen. Kid! Get down! But Izuku was already moving, stumbling out into the street, his mind trying to process the unfolding massacre. Cars were tossed aside like toys. People were running, screaming, their bodies tragically soft and fragile against the monster's obsidian blades. It was chaos. It was slaughter. Then, through the dust and the panic, he saw her. A little girl, no older than 5, standing frozen in the middle of the street. She had dropped a small, pink unicorn plushie and was staring at it, her face a mask of confusion and terror. Above her, a section of a 5-story office building, its support columns severed by one of the creature's limbs, began to groan. Rebar screamed as it was torn from concrete. A huge slab of the facade, tons of brick and steel, was peeling away from the building, poised to fall directly where the child stood. Time seemed to slow down. Izuku saw it all with horrifying clarity. The angle of the fall. The child's paralysis. The dozens of people running away from her, their own survival instinct overriding everything else. He looked for a hero in the sky. There was nothing. Just smoke and a terrified, empty blue. He wasn't strong. He wasn't fast. He was nothing. But in that frozen moment, none of it mattered. The years of analysis, of dreaming, of wishing, it all coalesced into a single, undeniable imperative. A hero saves people. His body moved on its own. He didn't remember making the decision to run. One second he was standing in the ruins of the comic shop, the next his legs were pumping, his lungs burning, his whole being focused on one single point in space. The small, terrified girl in the pink dress. The roar of the collapsing building was deafening. The shadow fell over them. He didn't have time to scoop her up, to carry her away. He just had time for one desperate act. He reached her, his sneakers sliding on the rubble-strewn asphalt. He didn't say a word. He just put his hands on her small shoulders and pushed. He shoved her forward with all his might. She stumbled and fell, tumbling out of the direct path of the falling debris, landing on a pile of relatively soft dirt from the ruptured street. Izuku, his momentum carrying him forward, was now directly under it. He had a single, crystal-clear thought as he looked up at the sky turning to concrete and steel. At least she's safe. The impact was not a sharp pain. It was a final, all-encompassing pressure. A universe of weight. He felt a sickening, wet crunch as his ribs and spine gave way. A searing, white-hot agony erupted in his abdomen as a thick spear of rebar, part of the falling debris, punched clean through him, pinning him to the asphalt below. The world dissolved into a kaleidoscope of pain and static. His vision tunneled. The sounds of the city, the monster, the screaming, it all faded into a distant, underwater roar. He tasted dust and blood. A profound cold, the kind that starts in the marrow and spreads outwards, began to seep into his limbs. He was dying. He knew it with absolute certainty. Through the gray haze of his fading consciousness, he saw a flash of movement. A blur of blue, white, and red. A sonic boom, the one he had fantasized about for years, finally reached his ears, not as a symbol of hope, but as a dull, percussive thud. Omni-Man had arrived. From Izuku's grounded, dying perspective, the battle was a surreal puppet show. He saw Omni-Man as a vector of pure violence. There was no struggle, no heroic posturing. It was extermination. A red-gloved fist, moving faster than the eye could see, hammered into one of the monster's legs, shattering the chitinous armor like porcelain. A second blow obliterated the joint. The creature roared, a sound that vibrated through Izuku's broken body, and swiped at the hero with its scythe-like claws. Omni-Man didn't dodge. He moved through the attack, letting the blades scrape harmlessly off his chest. His hands became a blur, striking the creature's less armored torso. Each impact was like a cannon shot, pulverizing flesh and bone. He drove the monster backwards, away from the civilians, his movements a terrifying display of geometric efficiency. He wasn't fighting it, he was disassembling it. He grabbed two of its limbs, planted his feet on the ground, and pulled. The sound of a giant tree being torn apart root from stem echoed through the street. Alien viscera rained down. The monster flailed, mortally wounded. Omni-Man flew straight up, 100 feet into the air, then turned. He became a living missile, diving headfirst into the creature's eyeless face. The impact liquefied the monster's head and drove its colossal body halfway into the ruptured earth, where it twitched once, then lay still. Silence descended, broken only by the crackle of fires and the distant wail of approaching sirens. Omni-Man landed beside the dead creature, his suit splattered with purple gore. He stood for a moment, surveying the damage, his expression unreadable. His gaze swept over the rubble, the overturned cars, the dead. It was the look of a farmer surveying a field after a hailstorm. Annoyance. Impatience. Then his eyes found Izuku. He floated over, his boots hovering an inch above the blood-soaked ground. He looked down at the boy impaled on the rebar, at the pool of crimson spreading out from under him. He recognized him instantly, the neighbor kid. The strange, obsessive boy who followed him with his eyes and filled notebooks with his exploits. Mark's friend. For a moment, Nolan Grayson felt nothing. This was the natural state of things. A fragile human had made a foolish, sentimental gesture and had paid the price. It was a rounding error in the grand equation of planetary defense. But then, he heard a sound that cut through his cold calculus. A raw, animal cry of pure anguish. Izuku! He turned. Pushing through the gathering crowd of stunned survivors were two women, Inko Midoriya, her face a deathly pale mask of horror, and his wife, Debbie, holding her back, her own face streaked with tears. They had been shopping a few blocks away when the attack happened. They had seen the news report, seen the location, and rushed here, fearing the worst. Their fears were now being realized in the most horrific way imaginable. Inko collapsed to her knees, a choked sob tearing from her throat. Debbie rushed forward. Nolan! Oh God, Nolan, is that? It's Izuku! Nolan looked from his weeping wife, to the hysterical mother, and back down to the dying boy. And in that moment, his internal equation changed. This was no longer an anonymous casualty. This was personal. This was happening on his lawn, metaphorically speaking. This was a mess. An imperfection. His son's best friend, dying 20 feet from him, while his wife and her best friend watched. It was an unacceptable complication. The optics were terrible. Debbie grabbed his arm, her nails digging into the invulnerable fabric of his suit. Nolan, do something! You have to! You're Omni-Man! He looked into her eyes, saw her genuine, human terror and grief. He felt a flicker of something alien to him. It wasn't compassion. It was irritation, a deep, profound annoyance that these fragile creatures and their messy emotions were complicating his mission. But he also knew he had to manage it. He had to maintain the facade. A flicker of guilt, maybe? No, not guilt. But the boy had acted heroically. Foolishly, yes. Inefficiently, absolutely. But he had sacrificed himself for another. It was the very ideal Nolan projected, twisted into a pathetic, bloody tableau. To let him die now, right here, would be a failure of the brand. He made a decision. It was cold, pragmatic, and wrapped in the guise of heroism. He knelt, his movements swift and sure. The crowd gasped. He placed his hands on the rubble, pinning Izuku down. Get back! He commanded, his voice imbued with absolute authority. All of you! He's mine! He didn't lift the rubble. He vaporized it, a controlled burst of heat from his eyes turning concrete and steel to incandescent dust. He then placed one hand on Izuku's forehead. It was clammy and cold, and the other under his broken back. With terrifying gentleness, he lifted the boy, rebar and all, from the ground. Izuku's head lolled back. His eyes, cloudy and unfocused, fluttered open. He saw the face from his posters, from his dreams, hovering above him. The square jaw. The mustache. The O on his chest. Mr. Grayson, he gurgled, a froth of blood at his lips. Don't speak, son, Nolan said, his voice a low, placating rumble. To the crowd, it was a moment of profound heroism. Omni-Man, the savior, cradling a fallen child. To Inko and Debbie, it was a desperate last hope. Nolan ignored them all. He looked down at the rapidly fading life in Izuku's eyes and made a second, more critical decision. He wouldn't take him to a hospital. They were useless. They would watch him die. He needed something better. Without another word, he bent his knees and shot into the sky, a blue and white rocket carrying a broken, bleeding payload. The sonic boom he left in his wake shattered the remaining windows for blocks, a final, deafening exclamation mark on the day's tragedy. The GDA's Olympus Medical Facility was less a hospital and more a laboratory for godlike biology. It was a sterile white bunker buried half a mile beneath Washington, D.C., accessible only by a secret subterranean tunnel. Omni-Man blasted through the final reinforced titanium door like it was tissue paper, landing in the primary trauma bay with Izuku still in his arms. The place erupted into controlled chaos. Doctors and scientists in sterile white suits swarmed him. "Sir! This is a restricted area!" A young, terrified doctor stammered. Nolan laid Izuku's body on a state-of-the-art diagnostic table. "Save him!" he ordered. The medical team rushed in. They cut away Izuku's blood-soaked clothes, attached sensors, and started shouting a litany of medical jargon that all amounted to the same conclusion. Massive internal hemorrhaging. The rebar pierced his descending aorta, liver, and left kidney. Spinal column is severed at T7. Multiple compound fractures. He's lost over 60% of his blood volume. We're losing him. He's crashing. A large monitor above the table displayed Izuku's vitals. His heart rate was a frantic, erratic flutter. His blood pressure was plummeting. "Get me O negative! 20 units, now!" the lead surgeon yelled. Nolan stepped forward, his shadow falling over the frantic scene. "No," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of an avalanche. The surgeon, a stern-faced woman named Dr. Eris, looked up at him, her mask unable to hide her disbelief. "What? He needs a transfusion or he'll be dead in 30 seconds. Your blood will not save him," Nolan stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "His system is too damaged. It's like trying to patch a sieve with water. He needs something more robust." Dr. Eris stared. The first thing to return was sound. A single, rhythmic beep, as monotonous and persistent as a leaky faucet in the dead of night. It was an anchor in a formless, gray void, a metronome counting out beats of something. Not life. Not death. Just a steady, unending pulse that vibrated through the nothingness. Then came sensation. A whisper of cool, recycled air against skin. The weight of a blanket, soft and surprisingly heavy. The vague pressure of something attached to his chest, and a faint tug at the crook of his arm. He was lying on his back, on a surface that was firm yet yielding. The ceiling was the first thing he saw. It was white. A perfect, seamless, almost luminous white, unlike the familiar popcorn texture of his bedroom ceiling with its water stains shaped vaguely like the continent of Australia. This was a sterile, unforgiving white. An unfamiliar ceiling. Izuku Midoriya's eyes fluttered open. The light was soft, indirect, yet it felt blindingly bright after the eternity he'd spent in the dark. He blinked, and the room slowly swam into focus. It was Spartan, clinical. The walls were the same seamless white as the ceiling. The only color came from the muted blues and greens of the complex monitor beside his bed, the source of the incessant beeping. His mind, a machine that never truly turned off, began to whir, sluggishly at first, then with gathering speed. Hospital. The antiseptic smell confirmed it. He remembered fire. Screaming. The roar of a collapsing building. A little girl in a pink dress. The suffocating, absolute weight. The rebar. His breath hitched. He tried to take a deep, shuddering gasp, bracing for the agony that memory promised. He expected a supernova of pain in his chest, a feeling of being torn in two. Nothing happened. He took another breath, deeper this time. His lungs filled with clean, cool air, easily and completely. There was no fire, no tightness, no phantom spear of metal restricting his diaphragm. He felt fine, more than fine. He felt a deep, resonant wellness that hummed in the very core of his being. The chronic ache in his lower back from years of hunching over notebooks was gone. The slight wheeze he sometimes had from seasonal allergies was absent. He felt rested, whole, and imbued with a strange, vibrant energy that made his fingers and toes tingle. This was wrong. This was impossible. His eyes darted around the room, taking in more detail. A simple chair was tucked into the corner. A closed door with no visible handle. And sitting in the chair, her head slumped forward in exhausted sleep, was his mother. "Mom?" His voice was a dry and used croak. Inko Midoriya's head snapped up. Her eyes, red-rimmed and shadowed with exhaustion, widened. For a moment, she just stared, as if seeing a ghost. Then, her face crumpled, and a sound that was half sob, half laugh escaped her lips. "Izuku!" She launched herself from the chair, rushing to his bedside. She grabbed his hand, her own trembling violently. "Oh, Izuku! Oh, my baby! You're awake! You're awake!" Tears streamed down her face, fat droplets splashing onto the white blanket. He tried to squeeze her hand reassuringly, but his grip felt strangely powerful, and he had to consciously ease up to avoid hurting her. "I'm okay, Mom," he whispered, his voice still raspy. What happened?" Before she could answer, the door slid open with a near-silent hiss. Debbie Grayson entered, holding 2 cups of what smelled like coffee. She stopped dead when she saw Izuku's open eyes, her own welling up instantly. One of the coffee cups slipped from her grasp, splashing hot liquid across the sterile floor. She didn't even notice. "Oh, thank God!" she breathed, rushing to Inko's side and putting a supporting arm around her. "Inko, he's awake! He's really awake!" Behind Debbie, a third figure filled the doorway, his sheer presence seeming to dim the lights in the room. Nolan Grayson stood there, dressed not in his costume, but in civilian clothes, a simple dark sweater and slacks. He looked less like a god and more like a concerned neighbor, but the illusion was thin. The power was still there, coiled and dense, a silent hum of immense pressure that Izuku could now feel in a way he never had before. It was like standing next to a massive electrical transformer. Nolan's eyes, intense and piercing, met Izuku's. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Welcome back, son." The word, son, sent a jolt through Izuku. It was casual, but coming from Omni-Man, it felt like a royal decree. "Mr. Grayson," Izuku began, his mind a whirlwind of questions. "The monster, the little girl. Am I?" He couldn't bring himself to ask the question. "Am I dead?" "The monster is gone," Nolan said, his voice calm and steady, cutting through the emotional turmoil in the room. "The little girl is safe. You saved her life, Izuku." The relief that washed over Izuku was so profound it left him lightheaded. "I did it." The thought was a flare of light in his confusion. "I saved someone." "But how?" Izuku looked down at his own body, at the blanket covering him. He remembered the rebar. He remembered the feeling of his own body breaking. I should be." Inko squeezed his hand tighter, her knuckles white. "The doctors, they said you were, they said there was no hope." Her voice broke. "But Nolan, he didn't give up. He saved you." Izuku's gaze snapped back to the imposing figure in the doorway. Of course. It was always him. Who else could work a miracle of this magnitude? Nolan stepped fully into the room. He walked to the foot of the bed, his presence commanding the space. Debbie guided a still sobbing Inko back to the chair, murmuring comforting words. "The damage was too extensive for conventional medicine," Nolan explained, his tone factual, as if reading a mission report. "Your internal injuries were catastrophic. You had minutes at best." He paused, letting the grim reality sink in. "The Global Defense Agency has been working on various advanced medical technologies. Experimental projects. One of them is a serum, a regenerative agent derived from my own blood cells. It was untested on humans. It was a last resort. A 1 in a billion shot." Izuku stared at him, his mind reeling. A serum. Made from Omni-Man's blood. It made a perverse kind of sense. The ultimate hero, lending his very essence to save a life. It was a story straight out of a comic book. His comic book, the one he had just bought, was probably lost in the rubble. The thought was a distant, insignificant sadness, So, you gave me a shot? Izuku asked, trying to wrap his head around the concept. More than a shot, Nolan said, his expression unreadable. A full-body transfusion, essentially. It was the only way to repair the damage on a cellular level. We didn't know if your human physiology would accept it or reject it violently. For 3 days you were on the edge. Your body was at war with itself. 3 days. He had been lying here for 3 days, his body a microscopic battlefield. And he had won. He felt the truth of it in the steady, powerful thrum of his own heartbeat on the monitor. A deep, resonant beat that sounded slower and stronger than he remembered. Beep. 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 It worked. Izuku breathed, a sense of wonder eclipsing his fear. He felt an overwhelming wave of gratitude. He looked at Nolan, his eyes shining with unshed tears. He had worshipped this man as a symbol, an ideal. Now, he owed him his life, his very existence. Thank you, Mr. Grayson. I don't know what to say. There's nothing to say, Nolan said dismissively, though his eyes held Izuku's gaze. Just get better. Izuku nodded, filled with a new, burning resolve. He would get better. He would work harder than ever. He had been given a second chance, a miracle from his greatest hero. He couldn't waste it. He pushed himself up, wanting to sit. The movement felt surprisingly easy. His core felt solid, like forged steel. He placed his right hand on the bedside rail to lever himself into a sitting position. It was a thick, steel bar, bolted to the frame, designed to hold the weight of a full-grown man. He gripped it, and pushed. The sound was not a bend. It was a high-pitched, groaning shriek of metal under impossible stress. Izuku felt the rail deform in his grasp as if it were made of modeling clay. The bolts holding it to the bed frame sheared off with a series of sharp pings like gunshots in the quiet room. He was left sitting upright, holding a 2-foot section of twisted, mangled steel in his hand. Silence. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound. Izuku stared at the metal bar in his hand, his mind refusing to process what his senses were telling him. It was heavy, far heavier than it should be for him to hold so effortlessly. He could see his own fingerprints pressed deep into the metal, a perfect indentation of his grip. He looked up. His mother's hand was pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide with a new kind of fear. Debbie looked utterly poleaxed, her jaw hanging open, but it was Nolan's expression that froze the blood in Izuku's veins. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't shocked. He looked expectant. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, satisfaction perhaps, that was quickly masked. He looked like a scientist whose experiment had just performed exactly as predicted. The door hissed open again, breaking the spell. A man Izuku had only ever seen in news briefings and on conspiracy theory websites stepped into the room. He was impeccably dressed in a dark, tailored suit that seemed out of place in the medical bay. His face was a roadmap of scars, dominated by a long, jagged line that cut down across one eye, which was a milky, sightless white. The other eye, a piercing blue, swept across the scene, taking in the shocked women, the grim-faced Nolan, the boy sitting in the bed, and the mangled piece of steel in his hand. Cecil Stedman, the shadowy director of the Global Defense Agency, did not look surprised either. Well, Cecil said, his voice a dry, pragmatic rasp. It seems the patient is awake. And the side effects are manifesting. He gave a curt nod to the 2 doctors who had followed him in. Get them out of here, he ordered, gesturing to Inko and Debbie. Wait. What's happening? Inko cried, trying to push past one of the doctors. Izuku? What's going on? Ma'am, please, the doctor said gently but firmly. The director needs to speak with your son. Inko, it's all right, Debbie said, her voice shaking slightly as she put an arm around her friend. She looked from Cecil to Nolan, a dawning horror in her eyes. Let's go get some coffee. A fresh cup. She guided the protesting Inko out of the room, casting one last, terrified look back at Izuku. The door hissed shut, leaving Izuku alone with the 2 most powerful men on the planet. The room suddenly felt very small. Cecil walked over to the bed. He didn't look at Izuku. He looked at the twisted metal bar he was still holding. Impressive, he stated, not as a compliment, but as an observation. high-tensile medical-grade steel. Rated for a shear strength of over 80,000 psi. You tore it like wet paper. He finally met Izuku's gaze, his one good eye unnervingly direct. The story about the experimental serum? It was a lie. A necessary one, to manage your mother's expectations. But you're not the kind of boy who can function on a lie, are you, Mr. Midoriya? You're an analyst. You need the data. Izuku swallowed, his throat dry. He slowly, carefully, placed the steel bar on the blanket beside him. What did you do to me? Cecil pulled the corner chair over and sat down, crossing his legs. He looked utterly at ease. Nolan remained standing, a silent, imposing statue at the foot of the bed. Omni-Man didn't give you a serum, Cecil began, steepling his fingers. He gave you a full blood transfusion. Directly from him to you. We've theorized for years about Viltrumite biology. We know it's impossibly resilient. We suspect it operates on a near-viral level, seeking to reinforce and strengthen any system it's introduced to. What we didn't know was what would happen if it was introduced to human DNA on such a massive, systemic scale. He leaned forward. It didn't just heal you, Izuku. It overwrote you. The Viltrumite blood cells acted as a retroviral agent. They latched onto your own hematopoietic stem cells in your bone marrow. They inserted their DNA into yours. Every new blood cell your body has produced for the last 3 days, every repaired muscle fiber, every regenerated nerve ending, has been built from a new blueprint. A hybrid blueprint. Izuku's hero analyst brain, the part of him that thrived on data and systems, was struggling to keep up with the biological horror story Cecil was calmly narrating. Retroviral integration, hematopoietic stem cells, genetic chimera. You are no longer, strictly speaking, 100% human, Cecil stated, his voice devoid of any emotion. You are a human Viltrumite hybrid. The first of your kind, and as your little demonstration with the bed rail shows, you now possess a diluted, but still incredibly potent, version of Omni-Man's physiology. The words hit Izuku with the force of a physical blow. No longer human. His mind flashed back to 1,000 sci-fi horror movies, stories of mad science and monstrous transformations. He looked at his hands. They looked the same. The same long, slightly clumsy fingers, the same smattering of freckles. But underneath, at a level he could never see, he was now alien. A cold dread, far more terrifying than the prospect of death, began to creep up his spine. He was a freak. A monster made in a lab. But then, another part of his brain, the desperate, dreaming part, latched onto the last part of Cecil's explanation. A version of Omni-Man's physiology. His eyes, wide with a dawning, terrifying hope, flickered from Cecil to Nolan. His powers? He whispered. Strength, invulnerability, speed, flight. Cecil ticked off the points on his fingers. All the hallmarks of a Viltrumite. Your potential is currently unknown. You're not a pureblood, so you'll likely never reach his level. But even a fraction of Omni-Man's power makes you one of the most powerful beings on this planet. Izuku's heart, that new, strong, steady heart, began to beat faster. The beeping on the monitor increased its tempo. This wasn't a horror story. This was a miracle. A twisted, terrifying, beautiful miracle. It was the dream he had mourned his entire life. The hope he had buried under mountains of analysis and vicarious worship. The memory of a rainy day, of a gaunt, skeletal hero standing on a rooftop, crashed into his mind. It's not bad to dream, kid. But you need to be realistic. All Might's words from a world away, a life he couldn't remember, echoed with the sting of ultimate rejection. He remembered the cold emptiness, the feeling of his soul turning to ash. He had been told no by his idol, by his mother's tears, by his own quirkless body. And now, Cecil Stedman and Omni-Man were telling him yes. Cecil watched the play of emotions on Izuku's face, the horror, the confusion, the dawning, manic glee. He had seen it all before, in astronauts who touched alien artifacts, and soldiers exposed to mutagenic agents. He knew this was the critical moment. This presents the Global Defense Agency with a problem, and an opportunity. Cecil continued, his voice taking on a sharper, more pragmatic edge. The problem is a teenager with the potential to level a city block by throwing a tantrum. You are, for all intents and purposes, an unregistered weapon of mass destruction. We can't just let you go back to high school. Izuku flinched. The cold reality of Cecil's words punctured his euphoria. He would be a prisoner. A lab rat. But the opportunity, Cecil said, leaning in again, his one good eye gleaming, is far more interesting. Omni-Man is a god, but he is just one man. The threats to this planet are growing. They are becoming more frequent, more powerful. The guardians of the globe are our best and brightest, but they are reactive. We need more. We need assets we can shape, that we can guide. He gestured towards Nolan. Omni-Man has agreed to take you under his wing. To train you. To teach you how to control this gift. You will become his official protégé. His partner. The room fell silent again. Izuku looked from Cecil's calculating face to Nolan's stoic one. A partner. A sidekick. He had spent his entire life analyzing heroes, and now he was being offered a chance to be one. To stand next to the greatest of them all. The name, unspoken, hung in the air. A boy with the powers of a Superman-like figure. The junior partner. Superboy. It was too much. The weight of his own powerlessness, the years of bitter tears, of desperate prayers, of filling notebooks because it was the only way he could touch the world of heroes, it all came crashing down on him. The dam of a lifetime of repressed longing finally broke. Tears, hot and fast, began to stream down his face. But they were not tears of fear or sadness. They were tears of profound, earth-shattering, soul-cleansing relief. He looked at Cecil, at the man who had just told him he was no longer human, and asked the only question that had ever mattered. Can I be a hero now? The words were barely a whisper, choked with emotion. But they were a plea, a prayer, and an acceptance all in one. Cecil Stedman's scarred face broke into a thin, triumphant smile. He had him. Yes, Mr. Midoriya. You can. We're going to make you the greatest hero the world has ever seen. Izuku's gaze shifted to Nolan. His idol. His savior. His father in a bizarre, biological sense. He saw the faint, almost imperceptible nod. The approval. It was everything he had ever wanted. He clenched his fists atop the blanket. He could feel it. The humming, buzzing energy. The limitless strength coiled in his muscles. It felt like coming home. I'll do it, Izuku said, his voice stronger now, laced with a tearful, unwavering determination. I accept. I'll be your superboy. Cecil stood up, his work done. He nodded to Nolan. He's all yours. The training facilities at the Pentagon are being prepared. Get him ready. He walked to the door and paused, his hand on the panel. He looked back at Izuku, his expression hardening slightly. One last thing, son, Cecil said, his voice dropping the paternal tone and adopting a cold, hard finality. Welcome to the GDA. Don't ever make me regret this. The door hissed shut, leaving Izuku once again alone with his new mentor. Nolan walked to the side of the bed. He looked down at Izuku, his expression still a mask of stone. But Izuku, his perceptions now heightened, could see the minute details. The slight tensing of his jaw, the way his eyes focused not on Izuku's face, but on his chest, as if listening to the beat of his new Viltrumite heart. There will be rules, Nolan said, his voice a low rumble. My rules. The training will be harder than anything you can possibly imagine. I will break you down to your component parts, and rebuild you into something useful. Something strong. I understand, Izuku said, wiping the tears from his eyes with the back of his hand. He would endure anything. He would pay any price. We'll tell your mother you've been accepted into a GDA accelerated training program for support staff. Nolan continued, already plotting the logistics. It's a cover that will hold. For now. A knock at the door, soft and hesitant. Nolan called. Enter. Inko and Debbie crept back in. Inko's eyes were wide with fear, searching Izuku's face for answers. Izuku? What did he want? Are you in trouble? She asked, her voice trembling. Izuku looked at his mother, at her terrified, loving face, and felt a pang of guilt. He was about to lie to her, the first of many. But it was for the greater good. It was for the dream. He gave her a watery, but brilliant smile. Mom, something amazing has happened. He couldn't tell her the truth. Not yet. Maybe never. He couldn't tell her that her fragile, quirkless son was now a half-alien weapon. But as he sat there, feeling the impossible power thrumming beneath his skin, a strength he had only ever dreamed of, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. His life, the small, sad, frustrating life of Izuku Midoriya, was over. And the life of Superboy was just beginning. The GDA training facility beneath the Pentagon was not a gym. It was a cage. A state-of-the-art, billion-dollar cage designed for the singular purpose of containing and stress-testing gods. The walls were a 50-foot thick sandwich of carbon nanotube latticework, depleted uranium, and a classified energy-dampening alloy. The floor was a spring-loaded seismic buffer that could absorb the impact of a tactical nuke. The ceiling was a holographic projector that could simulate any environment, from the crushing pressure of the Mariana Trench to the vacuum of deep space. To Izuku, it was the most terrifying and exciting place he had ever been. He stood in the center of the vast, circular chamber, wearing a simple gray GDA issue jumpsuit. It felt loose on his frame, a reminder of how scrawny he'd been just a few weeks ago. His body was changing, though. He could feel it. The hollows in his cheeks were filling out. His shoulders were broadening. When he flexed his arm, hard ridges of muscle he'd never seen before popped into existence. The Viltrumite DNA was not just healing him, it was optimizing him, rebuilding him from the ground up into a more efficient biological machine. Nolan Grayson, Omni-Man, floated in the air 10 feet in front of him, arms crossed, his expression one of profound impatience. He was in his full costume, a stark reminder of the gulf that still existed between them. He was the master. Izuku was the apprentice. The raw clay. The first lesson is the most important. Nolan's voice boomed, echoing slightly in the immense space. Your power is not a tool you wield. It is what you are. You do not ask it to perform. You command it. You are a Viltrumite. Act like it. Izuku nodded, his heart hammering with a mixture of eagerness and terror. Yes, sir, your human instincts will betray you. Nolan continued, his voice cold and didactic. You will want to be gentle. You will want to avoid breaking things. You will hesitate, worrying about collateral damage or the feelings of your opponent. These are weaknesses. A threat neutralized in 1 second cannot harm anyone in the second that follows. Speed, power, and overwhelming force are the purest forms of mercy. Do you understand? I think so, Izuku stammered. The philosophy was a brutal departure from the heroic ideals he cherished, the all-might-inspired creed of smiling to reassure people, of saving everyone. Nolan's way was the way of the surgeon, not the savior. It was about excising a cancer with a blade, not comforting the patient. Thinking is not enough. You will do. Nolan gestured to the far side of the chamber. A section of the wall shimmered, then resolved into a massive, 20-foot-thick block of reinforced concrete, the kind used for bunker construction. Punch it, Izuku blinked. Punch it? That is what I said. But with what technique? A straight? A hook? Should I focus on kinetic energy transfer, try to find a resonant frequency to create microfractures? Nolan's sigh was a gust of wind that ruffled Izuku's hair. You're doing it again. Analyzing. Theorizing. You are not in a library, Izuku. You are a hammer. That is a nail. Hit it. Izuku swallowed, his throat dry. He turned to face the slab of concrete. It was an immovable object, a monument to human engineering. His human brain screamed at him that punching it would be like punching a mountain. His hand would shatter into a pulp of bone and gore. But he wasn't just human anymore. He took a deep breath, trying to silence the screaming monkey of his old self. He remembered Nolan's words. You are a hammer. He drew his fist back, trying to emulate the form he'd seen Omni-Man and other heroes use 1,000 times in news footage. He put his hip into it, pivoted on his foot, and threw the punch. He did not shout. Smash! The name felt sacrilegious here, a relic of a childish dream. This was real. His fist connected with the concrete. The result was anticlimactic. There was a loud crack and a puff of concrete dust. A spiderweb of fractures radiated out from the point of impact, and a shallow, fist-sized crater was indented in the surface. His knuckles stung, a dull, vibrating ache that was more surprising than painful. He had damaged it, yes, but he hadn't obliterated it. It was the equivalent of a normal man punching drywall. He looked down at his scraped, faintly throbbing knuckles, a wave of shame washing over him. He had the blood of a god in him, and that was the best he could do. Nolan floated down until his boots touched the floor. He walked over and stood beside Izuku, looking at the pathetic crater. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed, which was infinitely worse. "You punched it like a human," Nolan said, his voice flat. "You used your muscles, your bones, your technique. You were thinking about form. You held back, subconsciously, to protect your own body. A Viltrumite does not hold back. We do not fear breaking." He turned to the wall. "Watch." He didn't draw his arm back. He didn't pivot or shift his weight. From a completely stationary position, he simply extended his fist forward. It was not a punch. It was a leisurely push, the kind of motion one might use to close a car door. His knuckles touched the concrete. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then, the entire 20-foot slab of concrete dissolved. It didn't explode. It didn't shatter. It disintegrated into a cloud of fine gray powder, which was immediately sucked into the room's humming filtration vents. A perfect, omni-man-shaped hole now existed in the wall, revealing the gleaming dark alloy behind it. Izuku stared, his jaw agape. There had been no sonic boom, no visible shockwave. Just a quiet, absolute negation of matter. "How?" Izuku whispered, his analyst's brain completely fried. "The physics, the kinetic energy required for that is impossible. You didn't even move, I told you. It's not about movement. It's about will," Nolan said, turning back to him. "Viltrumite physiology is psionically interactive on a molecular level. Our skin, our muscles, our bones, they are surrounded by a cohesive telekinetic field. It's what gives us our invulnerability. It's what allows us to fly. When I punch something, I am not just hitting it with my fist. I am projecting that field. I am telling the molecules of the target to get out of my way. Your human mind is not used to this concept. You think in terms of push and pull. You need to start thinking in terms of command." He pointed at the wall. Again, and so began the training montage from hell. For weeks, Izuku's life was a cycle of pain, frustration, and infinitesimal progress. Every day, he would punch the wall. Every day, his human instincts would hold him back, and he would only manage to chip away at the concrete. And every day, Nolan would sigh, disintegrate the slab with a flick of his wrist, and order him to do it again. The lessons were always brutal, always stripped of any heroic context. It was never about saving people. It was about pure, efficient application of power. "Stop dodging," Nolan would command as he hurled minivan-sized chunks of wreckage at Izuku. "You are not made of glass. Let it hit you. Learn to trust your invulnerability." The first time Izuku forced himself to stand still, the chunk of metal wrapped around his body like tinfoil, the impact feeling like a hard shove. He didn't have a scratch on him. "Push through the obstacle, not around it," Nolan instructed, as Izuku tried to navigate a complex laser grid. Izuku's instinct was to weave and flip like a gymnast. Nolan simply walked through the beams, which sizzled and refracted harmlessly off his skin. Wasted energy. A straight line is always the most efficient path. A broken bone is a small price for ending a threat quickly, Nolan stated coolly after Izuku hesitated to stop a training drone because a simulated civilian was in the path of the debris. The drone, in the simulation, went on to detonate a bomb. "The mission is paramount. Triage is not a suggestion, it is a law. You cannot save everyone. You save the most you can by eliminating the threat as fast as possible. Sentiment is a luxury you cannot afford." Izuku absorbed it all, his new notebook, a GD-issued, fireproof, waterproof datapad, filling up with frantic notes. He titled it, Viltrumite Power Analysis. Entry 17. The core of Viltrumite power is not biological, but psionic. The smart atoms theory is a misnomer. The atoms themselves are not intelligent. They are manipulated by a localized, subconscious telekinetic field. This field is the source of invulnerability and strength. Ergo, Strength is not a function of muscle mass, but of mental focus and willpower. Must learn to project the field beyond my skin. Entry 23. Pain is a data point. My body now heals at an accelerated rate. A fractured ulna from a miscalculated impact healed in 3 hours. The pain was intense, but fleeting. Nolan's hypothesis. The healing process draws energy directly from the psionic field. Need to test caloric intake versus healing speed. He tried to reconcile Nolan's brutal philosophy with his own ingrained heroism. Maybe Omni-Man was right. Maybe on this scale, with this level of power, compassion was a weakness. All Might could afford to save everyone with a smile because his enemies were, relatively speaking, weak. Omni-Man fought cosmic horrors. He didn't have time to be gentle. Izuku tried to adopt the mindset, to see the cold logic in it. He repeated Nolan's words to himself like a mantra. Speed. Power. Overwhelming force. But at night, in his sterile GDA quarters, he would dream of the little girl in the pink dress. He hadn't saved her with overwhelming force. He had saved her with a simple, human push. A sacrifice. His new power felt like a betrayal of that simple, pure act. One Saturday, Cecil Stedman granted him a day pass. Go home, the scarred man had ordered. See your mother. Maintain your cover. Be normal for a day. It's important for psychological stability. Returning to his neighborhood felt like visiting a foreign country. The houses seemed small and fragile. The people seemed slow, their movements languid and uncertain. He felt like a giant crammed into a dollhouse. His mother, of course, fussed over him. She said he looked healthier, that the GDA nutrition plan was clearly working. She didn't notice the new, hard look in his eyes, or the way he instinctively calculated the structural weak points of their house. The real culture shock came when he went next door. He found Mark in his room, slouching in his gaming chair, complaining about his job at the Burger Mart. Dude, it's the worst, Mark groaned. My manager, Tim, is a total tool. And I accidentally dropped a whole basket of fries into the deep fryer yesterday. Splashed hot grease everywhere. Look, he held up his arm, showing a faint red splotch. Izuku stared at the minor burn. A week ago, he had been hit by a plasma bolt in a training simulation that had melted the skin off his arm. It had healed completely by the time he'd finished his post-session report. You have to be more careful, Mark, Izuku said, his voice coming out flatter, more detached than he intended. Yeah, well, whatever. Mark tossed the comic book onto his bed. So, how's the GDA intern thing? Still crunching numbers for the big guys? It's demanding, Izuku said, the lie tasting like ash. Lots of data analysis. Suddenly, Mark yelped and shot to his feet, knocking his chair over. He looked at his hands, his eyes wide with shock and confusion. Whoa! What the hell? What? What's wrong? Izuku asked, instantly on alert. I don't know. My hand, it feels all tingly. Like buzzy. Mark clenched and unclenched his fists. He looked dizzy. He stumbled and grabbed his desk to steady himself, and his fingers sank half an inch into the solid oak. Izuku's eyes widened. He recognized the signs. The initial disorientation. The tingling sensation of the psionic field activating. The sudden, uncontrolled surge of strength. Mark, Izuku said, his voice low and steady, trying to channel Nolan's calm authority. It's happening. Mark stared at him, then at his hand, then back at Izuku. A look of dawning comprehension, mixed with sheer panic, spread across his face. No way. You think, it's starting, Izuku confirmed. Your powers. They're finally manifesting. The news threw the Grayson household into a strange mixture of relief and chaos. Debbie was overjoyed, the years of quiet worry that her son was a dud, finally melting away. Nolan, for his part, displayed a new level of interest in his son that was both paternal and predatory. It's about time, Nolan said that evening, as Mark accidentally floated a few inches off the living room floor before crashing into a bookshelf. Your Viltrumite cells are finally reaching maturity. Good, now Nolan had 2 protégés. And his preference was immediately, painfully obvious. The next training session was different. Mark was there, clumsy and terrified in his own GDA jumpsuit. While Izuku had to struggle and intellectualize every aspect of his new powers, Mark was a natural. His strength, his invulnerability, it was all intuitive, a birthright he was just now learning to access. Nolan's demeanor towards Mark was completely different. He was still a harsh teacher, but there was a current of pride, of approval, that Izuku had never received. "You see, Mark?" Nolan would say after Mark, through sheer instinct, managed to stop a projectile that Izuku had to meticulously calculate the trajectory of. "It's in your blood. You don't have to think, you just have to be." When he spoke to Izuku, the tone was different. "Your human half makes you hesitant, Izuku. You rely on your brain because your body's instincts are flawed. You will always have to work harder to achieve what he is simply given. It stung more than any plasma bolt." Izuku, the boy who had always been defined by his mind, was now being told his greatest asset was his greatest weakness. He was the deluded one. The half-breed. Mark was the pureblood. The air, the breaking point, and the breakthrough, came during flight training. They were in the simulation chamber, the holographic ceiling displaying a perfect, cloud-dappled blue sky. "Flight is not about propulsion," Nolan lectured, floating effortlessly before them. "It is about focus. The same field that protects you can be manipulated. You tell it you want to be up, and it puts you up. You tell it you want to go forward, and it moves you forward. It is an act of pure will. Mark, you try." Mark, looking terrified, closed his eyes. He screwed up his face in concentration. He grunted, strained, and then, with a small lurch, he lifted a foot off the ground. Then another. He wobbled like a newborn foal, his arms pinwheeling, but he was doing it. He was hovering. A huge, goofy grin spread across his face. "I'm doing it! Dad, look! I'm flying!" he shouted before promptly losing concentration and tumbling back to the padded floor. Nolan actually chuckled. A real, genuine chuckle. "Good, son. Your balance is terrible, but the instinct is there. Control it." Then, he turned to Izuku. "Your turn." Izuku closed his eyes. He tried to do what Nolan said. He tried to will himself into the air. He pictured himself floating, tried to feel the psionic field around him. Nothing happened. He felt rooted to the floor, heavier than ever. "Stop trying." Nolan's voice was sharp. "Do. Command your body to rise." Izuku focused harder. He imagined the field lifting him, 1,000 tiny hands pushing him upward. He felt a slight lightness in his feet, a tingling sensation, but he remained stubbornly on the ground. He could hear Mark snickering in the background as he managed to wobble his way back into the air. Frustration burned in Izuku's chest. Why was this so hard? He could analyze the physics, he could understand the theory, but he couldn't make it happen. His analytical mind was getting in the way, trying to find a mechanism, a button to push, when there wasn't one. He was a failure. A faulty experiment. The boy who dreamed of flying was going to be forever grounded, even with the power of a god singing in his veins. Tears of frustration pricked at his eyes. He squeezed them shut, his mind racing, searching for an answer, for some piece of advice, some mantra that could help him break through this mental block. And from the deepest, most forgotten corner of his memory, a voice echoed. A booming, cheerful, and possibly heroic voice from a world he didn't know he remembered. "It's not about your arms, young man. It's about your core. Clench your butt cheeks and yell it from the bottom of your heart." The memory was so vivid, so out of place, that it shocked him out of his downward spiral. All Might. The name surfaced like a bubble from the deep. Who was that? Clench your butt cheeks. It was the stupidest piece of advice he had ever heard. It was completely unscientific. It had nothing to do with psionic fields or acts of will. It was crude, simple, and physical, and it was the only thing he hadn't tried. Ignoring Nolan's impatient sigh, Izuku took a deep, centering breath. He did as the phantom voice commanded. He squeezed every muscle in his core, from his abdomen to his glutes, creating a solid, unshakable pillar of tension in the center of his body. He wasn't thinking about psionic fields or commanding molecules anymore. He was focusing on a single, physical sensation, and he pushed that feeling down, as if trying to press his feet through the floor. He felt a lurch, not of rising, but of profound stability. The tingling energy in his body, which had been a chaotic, buzzing cloud, suddenly coalesced. It found a center. It found a focus, and he lifted off the ground. It wasn't a wobble or a lurch. It was a smooth, silent, perfect ascent. 1 foot. 5 feet. 10 feet. He rose into the air as if being drawn up by an invisible string, stopping when he was level with Nolan. He opened his eyes. He was floating. The ground was 20 feet below. He looked at his hands, then down at his body. He was perfectly still, perfectly balanced. The feeling was not one of lightness, but of absolute control. He had found the anchor point. A laugh, pure and unrestrained, burst from his lips. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. He had done it. He was flying. He twisted in the air, a little clumsy at first, then with growing confidence. He pushed off, not with his feet, but with his will, and shot across the chamber, a gray blur against the holographic sky. He came to a halt in front of Nolan and Mark, who was now back on the floor, staring up at him with his mouth open. For the first time, Nolan Grayson did not look disappointed or patronizing. He looked surprised. Genuinely surprised. He had expected Izuku to succeed eventually, through brute force and repetition. He had not expected this. This sudden, inexplicable leap in control. This grace. "How did you do that?" Nolan asked, his voice lacking its usual condescending edge. Izuku just grinned, floating serenely in the air, the tears of frustration now tears of triumph. He couldn't explain the ghost of a hero in his head. "I just found my center," he said, and for the first time since his training began, Izuku felt like he truly belonged in the sky. He might be the deluded one, the half-breed, but he was also the analyst, the one who had to understand it to master it. And in that moment, he realized that what Nolan saw as his greatest weakness might just be his greatest strength. He could fly, and nothing would ever be the same again. The first time Izuku saw the costume, he felt a profound and jarring sense of disappointment. He stood in one of the GDA's numerous sub-basement labs, this one belonging to Art Rosenbaum, the legendary tailor to the superheroes. The room was a controlled chaos of fabrics that shimmered with impossible colors, mannequins draped in half-finished capes, and advanced sewing machines that hummed with latent energy. Art himself, a small, balding man with kind eyes magnified by thick spectacles, stood beside a chrome mannequin, beaming like a proud father. "Well, kid? What do you think?" Art asked, his voice thick with a Bronx accent that had survived decades in government black sites. "Latest in GDA tactical couture. One of a kind." On the mannequin was Izuku's future. His new identity. And it was aggressively practical. The suit was a two-piece, primarily a deep, muted cobalt blue. It was made of the same nigh-indestructible smart fabric as Omni-Man's, but it lacked any of the regal simplicity. It was covered in subtle, darker blue paneling that traced the major muscle groups, giving it a segmented, almost armored appearance. Thick, reinforced gauntlets covered the forearms, their design more akin to riot gear than a hero's costume. The boots were heavy, utilitarian, with thick, shock-absorbing soles. There was no cape. The only flashes of color were a pair of intersecting white lines that formed a stylized, abstract S over his heart, not the hopeful, flowing symbol of Superman from the old comics, but a sharp, almost aggressive emblem, and thin red piping that ran along the seams of the suit, giving it a touch of vibrancy. The final piece, lying on a table beside the mannequin, was a mask, a simple domino mask, the same cobalt blue as the suit, designed to obscure his identity. It was a uniform. A piece of military hardware. It had none of the aspirational grandeur he had dreamed of, none of the bright, primary colors that screamed hope to a frightened populace. "It's," Izuku began, searching for a diplomatic word. "It's very functional." Art laughed, a wheezy, genuine sound. "That's Cecil for you." He wanted something that said GDA asset, not Boy Scout. "Nolan, he can get away with the classic look. He's a brand. You, kid, you're the new model. All function, no fuss." He patted the suit's chest. "Don't let the simple look fool you. It's got a full-spectrum comms unit woven into the collar, biomonitors in the lining that feed directly to the GDA, and the gauntlets can be magnetized to 10,000 Tesla. Good for grabbing falling girders or, misbehaving robots. Cecil Stedman, who had been observing from the doorway, stepped into the room. It's a design that commands respect, not affection, he said, his voice a dry rasp. You are not here to be liked, son, you are here to be effective. The name we've chosen reflects that. He gestured to the suit. You are the junior partner to Omni-Man. A boy with the power of a Superman. The media will need a name. They will call you Superboy. There it was. The name he'd secretly hoped for and dreaded. It felt derivative, unearned. A hand-me-down title. But it was his. Superboy. Izuku repeated, the name feeling strange and heavy in his mouth. He looked at the soulless, tactical suit and the generic, focus-grouped name. This wasn't the dream he'd had as a child. It was a cold, corporate, militarized version of it. But it was real. It was his only path. I'll wear it with pride, sir, he said, his voice more confident than he felt. Cecil nodded, satisfied. You'll have your first public debut tomorrow. A simple one. A photo op with Omni-Man and the new lineup for the teen team. Just smiling and waving. We need to introduce you to the world in a controlled environment before we let you off the leash. The leash was let off sooner than anyone expected. The next day, Izuku stood on a freshly assembled stage in a park in downtown Washington, D.C., the Capitol building providing a suitably patriotic backdrop. He was in the suit. It felt like a second skin, impossibly light yet imbued with a sense of immense durability. The domino mask felt strange, a thin barrier between Izuku Midoriya and the world. To his right stood Omni-Man, a pillar of stoic confidence. To his left, Mark, looking deeply uncomfortable in his own brand-new costume. Mark's suit was a stark contrast to Izuku's. It was a bold yellow and black, with a sweeping, full-face mask and goggles. It was dynamic, eye-catching, and entirely art's design, free from Cecil's pragmatic influence. He had chosen his own name, one that felt both arrogant and deeply insecure. Invincible. Beside them stood the teen team, Robot, a walking automaton whose true identity was a mystery. Duplicate, who could create endless copies of herself, and Rexplode, a brash, arrogant youth with the power to charge objects with kinetic energy, turning them into bombs. It was supposed to be a simple press conference. A formal introduction of Omni-Man's two new protégés. Izuku had practiced his smile in the mirror for an hour, trying to find the right balance between humble and confident. He never got to use it. Just as the mayor was stepping up to the podium, a guttural roar echoed from the sky. A shadow fell over the park. Izuku's head snapped up, his enhanced senses already pinpointing the threat. It was a Zacian obliterated drone, a rogue piece of alien wartech that occasionally fell out of orbit. It looked like a giant metallic jellyfish, its tentacles crackling with raw energy as it descended upon the crowd. Panic erupted. The press, the politicians, the public, they all scattered, screaming, "Showtime, boys!" Nolan said, his voice calm, almost bored. His eyes, however, were fixed on his two apprentices. This was a test. Rexplode was the first to react, his arrogance overriding any sense of caution. "I got this!" he yelled. He grabbed a handful of pebbles from a decorative garden, which began to glow with a pulsing orange light. With a flick of his wrist, he sent them zipping towards the drone. They exploded against its metallic hide in a series of bright, but ultimately useless, flashes. "Damn it!" Rex cursed, as the drone barely even registered the attack. "Invincible! Superboy! Flank it! Draw its fire away from the civilians!" Omni-Man commanded before blurring into motion himself, a blue and white streak rocketing towards the drone's main body. Mark, now invincible, shot into the air, his flight still a bit wobbly. "On it, Dad!" he yelled, flying straight towards the drone's energy tentacles. Izuku's mind, the analyst's brain that Nolan had tried so hard to suppress, kicked into overdrive. He wasn't just seeing a monster, he was seeing a system. He saw the panicked civilians scrambling in every direction, creating chaos. He saw the drone's firing pattern, how it targeted the largest clusters of movement. He saw the structural integrity of the stage, the nearby statues, the ancient oak trees. It was all a complex, deadly equation, and he was the only one who saw all the variables. Triage is a law, Nolan's voice echoed in his head. Eliminate the threat. That meant ignoring the civilians. It meant a direct, overwhelming assault. It was the Viltrumite way. Mark was already doing it. He flew headfirst into the drone, his fists a blur of yellow and black. He was a powerhouse, each punch landing with the force of a wrecking ball, sending shudders through the drone's chassis and causing chunks of alien metal to rain down on the park below. He was strong. He was direct. He was also causing immense collateral damage. A severed tentacle, still crackling with energy, crashed down and vaporized a park bench. A piece of shrapnel the size of a car door embedded itself in the Lincoln Memorial steps. Izuku watched, horrified. Mark was fighting the monster, but he wasn't protecting the people. He looked at the scattering crowd. An elderly couple had fallen. A terrified mother was trying to shield her child. They weren't going to make it out of the blast radius if another piece of the drone came down. Sentiment is a luxury you cannot afford. The words felt like poison. He looked at the family, at their terrified faces. He remembered the little girl in the pink dress. He had died for her. Had he been rebuilt just to forget that lesson? In that moment, Izuku made a choice. He was Superboy, but he was still Izuku Midoriya. He ignored the drone. He shot forward, not up. He flew low to the ground, a cobalt blur moving with a precision that bordered on prescient. He reached the fallen elderly couple and, without stopping, scooped them up, one under each arm. Their combined weight was nothing to him. "Hold on!" he shouted, his voice electronically modulated by the comms in his suit. He deposited them safely behind the solid granite base of a war memorial, 100 yards away. Before they could even thank him, he was gone. He saw the mother and child, frozen in fear. He landed in front of them, turning his back to the battle, his body a living shield. A large piece of debris, dislodged by one of Invincible's punches, came whistling down. It slammed into Izuku's back with a deafening clang and crumpled against his invulnerable spine. He didn't even flinch. "Get to safety!" he commanded, his voice firm but not unkind. "Now!" The mother, shocked into action, grabbed her child's hand and ran. Izuku's mind was now a whirlwind of tactical calculations, but they weren't about destroying the drone. They were about crowd control. Damage mitigation. He wasn't a hammer. He was a shepherd's crook, guiding the flock away from the wolf. He saw a group of people bottlenecked at a narrow park exit. He landed before them, grabbed the wrought iron fence on either side of the gate, and tore it from its concrete moorings as if it were made of paper, creating a wider opening. "This way! Keep moving!" Omni-Man and Invincible were still pummeling the drone, which was now starting to smoke and spark, its movements becoming more erratic. It fired a wild energy blast that went wide, heading straight for a crowded bus stop outside the park. There was no time to move the people. Izuku acted on pure instinct and a flash of analytical genius. He flew into the path of the blast, but he didn't just tank it. He remembered a lesson from his own notebooks, a theory about air pressure. He cupped his hands together and, just before the blast hit him, clapped them with all his might. "Delaware!" Smash! The true name from his forgotten past, tore from his lips, a primal roar of desperate effort. The force of the clap was monumental. It created a concussive wave of compressed air, a solid wall of force that met the energy blast head-on. The two forces collided with a sound like tearing reality. The energy dissipated, shunted upwards into the sky in a harmless firework display of blue light. The people at the bus stop were knocked off their feet by the shockwave, but they were alive. Unharmed. From the corner of his eye, Izuku saw Omni-Man pause his assault for a fraction of a second, his head turning to watch. It was a look Izuku couldn't decipher. With the civilians clear, Izuku finally turned his full attention to the battle. He saw what Omni-Man and Invincible, in their direct assault, had missed. A pulsing, glowing power core was now exposed in a gash on the drone's underbelly. He didn't fly towards it. He flew down. He landed on the street, ripped a manhole cover from the asphalt, and with a flick of his wrist sent it spinning through the air like a discus. He had already calculated the trajectory, the rotation, the velocity. The heavy iron disc flew true. It didn't hit the power core. It hit the armored casing just beside it, the spinning edge striking with enough force to shear through a weakened seam. The casing peeled back, and the power core was now completely exposed and vulnerable. Invincible, now! The core! Izuku yelled into his comms. Mark, seeing the opening, dove. He plunged his fists into the glowing sphere. The drone let out a final, electronic shriek, imploded in a silent flash of light, and then rained down in a shower of harmless, inert metal confetti. Silence descended. The battle had lasted less than 90 seconds. The crowd, which had been cowering, slowly began to emerge. They looked at the debris, at the smoking crater where the drone had been, and then at the heroes. They started to cheer. Mark, aka Invincible, landed in the center of the park, striking a triumphant pose. He had beaten the monster. He had saved the day. The cheers were for him. But then, the sentiment began to shift. A news helicopter that had been circling overhead focused its camera on the bus stop, where shaken but grateful people were pointing not at Invincible, but at the blue-clad hero who was now helping a dazed old woman to her feet. The camera panned to the widened gate, then to the family safe behind the memorial. The narrative of the day was changing in real time. Invincible was the muscle. He was impressive. But Superboy was the hero. He was the one who had been down on the ground with them, the one who had shielded them, the one who had saved them, not just the city. Izuku could hear his name, his new name, being chanted by the crowd. Superboy! Superboy! He felt a flush of pride, warm and bright. He had done it. He had found a way to merge his own ideals with his new power. He looked over at Mark, expecting to share a look of triumph. But Mark wasn't looking at him. He was looking at their father. And Nolan Grayson was not looking at the cheering crowd. He was not looking at the wreckage. He was staring directly at Izuku, his expression as cold and hard as the vacuum of space. There was no pride in his eyes. There was no approval. There was only a quiet, burning fury. Later, back in the sterile confines of the GDA facility, the fury was no longer quiet. What was that? Nolan demanded, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He floated in the center of the training chamber, forcing Izuku and Mark to look up at him. What was what? We won! Mark said, still buzzing from the adrenaline of his first real fight. We kicked its ass! You kicked its ass! Nolan corrected, his icy gaze fixed on Izuku. While he was playing crossing guard, Izuku flinched as if struck. I was protecting the civilians! There would have been dozens of casualties from the collateral damage if casualties are acceptable losses in a planetary defense scenario. Nolan roared, his voice shaking the very walls of the chamber. Your objective was the threat. You abandoned your post, you disobeyed a direct order, and you wasted precious seconds on sentiment. That Zacian drone had a self-destruct sequence that could have leveled 10 city blocks. We were lucky Invincible destroyed it before it could arm. Your hesitation could have cost millions of lives, but it didn't, Izuku argued, his own anger starting to rise. I saved people and helped stop the drone. There's a better way to do this. We don't have to choose between saving the city and saving the people in it. You are a soldier, not a philosopher. Nolan shot back. You are given a target, and you eliminate it. You do not question the methods. You do not improvise. You obey. That's not being a hero, that's being a weapon! Izuku yelled, the words torn from his throat. I didn't almost die just to become your mindless drone. The moment the words left his mouth, he knew he had made a mistake. The temperature in the room seemed to drop by 20 degrees. Nolan descended slowly until his feet touched the floor. He walked towards Izuku, each step a quiet thunderclap. Mark, sensing the shift, took an instinctive step back. Nolan stopped directly in front of Izuku, so close that Izuku could see his own terrified reflection in the dark pupils of his mentor. I gave you this power, Nolan said, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. It is a gift. One I can just as easily take away. You exist at my pleasure. Do not ever forget that. He didn't lay a hand on him, but the threat was absolute. He was an ant arguing with a god. Your methods are inefficient, Nolan continued, his voice returning to its cold, lecturing tone. You spent your energy saving a handful of people when you should have been focused on the source of the danger. You acted like a human. A weak, sentimental, inefficient human. He turned and looked at Mark. Invincible, on the other hand, performed adequately. He was direct. He was powerful. He focused on the objective. He is learning what it means to be a Viltrumite. He gave Mark a nod of approval that felt like a knife in Izuku's chest. You could learn from him. With that, he turned and flew out of the chamber, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. Mark shuffled his feet, looking deeply uncomfortable. Dude, he was pretty harsh. Izuku didn't answer. He just stood there, his fists clenched, his mind replaying the battle. He had saved people. He had done the right thing. The crowd had cheered for him. The public saw him as a hero, but his mentor, his idol, the man who gave him his powers, saw him as a failure. His comms unit crackled to life. It was Cecil's voice, dry and emotionless. Superba, a word. A moment later, Izuku stood before Cecil in his sterile office. The director was watching a replay of the battle on a holographic screen. He paused on an image of Izuku shielding the family with his body. Omni-Man is displeased, Cecil stated, not looking at him. I did my job, Izuku said, his voice tight. I protected the innocent. You did more than that, Cecil said, finally turning to face him. His scarred face was unreadable. You won the hearts and minds. The GDA has been flooded with positive press. They're calling you the people's hero. You've become more popular in one day than the team has in 2 years. From a public relations standpoint, your debut was a catastrophic success. Izuku blinked. Catastrophic? Omni-Man is our greatest asset, but he is also our greatest liability, Cecil said, lowering his voice. He is an alien of immense power with his own agenda. We don't know what it is. For years, he has been the only game in town. Now there's you. A hero with his power, but with a human heart. A hero the people love, not just fear. You are not just his partner, son, you are his counterweight. The implication was staggering. Cecil wasn't just training him to be a hero. He was grooming him to be a check on Omni-Man's power. Omni-Man wants a soldier, Cecil continued. I want a symbol. Keep doing what you're doing. Keep saving people. Let him be the hammer. You be the shield. But be smart about it. Do not push him too far. You are walking a razor's edge, kid. Izuku walked out of Cecil's office, his mind reeling. He was caught in a tug-of-war between two titans. Nolan wanted to forge him into a weapon. Cecil wanted to shape him into a symbol, and all he wanted to do was be a hero. He thought of his costume, the cold, practical suit. He thought of his new name, Superba, an identity given to him, not earned. He had a costume, but he was beginning to realize he also had a conscience, and the two did not align. That night, the news was dominated by two stories. The first was the spectacular debut of Superboy and Invincible. The second, a brief, tragic report at the end of the broadcast, sent a chill down Izuku's spine. A news anchor appeared on screen, her expression somber. And in shocking news tonight, a tragedy has struck the superhero community. The bodies of the Guardians of the Globe were discovered late this evening in a remote location. Sources are scarce, but the scene has been described as one of unimaginable violence. The GDA has yet to release an official statement, but one hero was found at the scene, clinging to life amidst the carnage. Omni-Man. The screen showed a grainy, long-lens photo. The bodies of War Woman, Red Rush, Aquarius, and the others, broken and strewn across a ruined landscape. And in the center of it all, kneeling, was the bloodied, tattered figure of Omni-Man. Izuku stared at the screen, his blood running cold. The Guardians. The greatest heroes on Earth, after Omni-Man, slaughtered. And his mentor, the invincible man he had just argued with, had been there. He had almost died. The anger he felt towards Nolan, the frustration, the resentment, it all evaporated, replaced by a wave of cold, sickening horror. His mentor, his hero, had been ambushed. While he had been preening for the cameras and arguing about tactics, Omni-Man had walked into a death trap. The guilt was a physical weight. He was a fool. A naive, arrogant child. Nolan wasn't just being harsh. He was trying to prepare him for a world where this could happen. A world where even the strongest could fall. Izuku Midoriya, the brand new hero called Superboy, sank to his knees in his sterile GDA room, utterly and completely devastated. The weight of the world he had so desperately wanted to carry had just come crashing down.